over the lunchtime break. So thank you for attending. I'm Leslie Sibilic. I'm a curator at the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh and a member of the programming committee for PA Museums. And this is the second session in our Lunch and Learn webinar series. We're hoping to give people some good ideas and some accessible information during the lunch period. We appreciate so many of you joining us today, and we are fortunate to have with us Kelsey Paul. She's the interim director of learning and visitor experience at the Frick Pittsburgh, and she has spent, I would say, quite a bit of time over the last year talking about the Frick's AASLH award-winning new version of their tour for Clayton. And I don't want to give away too much now, but we're really fortunate to have her here today to talk about what they did at the Frick here in Pittsburgh, and hopefully inspire you to maybe think about some new steps at your sites. Just a couple words of housekeeping before we get started. And I see most people are well acquainted with Zoom at this point. During the run of the program, we do ask that you keep your audio turned off and your cameras turned off so that everybody can enjoy Kelsey's program and presentation in the best possible manner. After she is done speaking, there will be a chance for Q&A, and you are welcome at that point, if you wish, to turn your cameras back on. In the interim, if you have thoughts or questions to share, please feel free to use the Q&A button or the chat. We'll be monitoring those. And if you have any other questions as well, please don't hesitate to ask. And a couple program notes too, for those of you who are thinking about hopefully the summer and the fall, save the date now. We have our PA Museums annual conference coming up in Erie, Pennsylvania. That's September 28th through 30th. And you might think that September seems like a long time away, but we're actually out looking for conference session proposals right now. We have an active call out that is running through March 16th. 2025. And if you are interested in proposing something, feel free to send a message in the chat or send us an email, and we'll be happy to kind of get you hooked up. There's a jot form link that's out there for anybody who is interested in proposing a session. And as I mentioned, this is a new Lunch and Learn program series for us. And so watch for more information again. There will be another session coming up on May 14th, 2025, featuring Mike Medea of the Independent Seaport Museum, and that will be focused on museum education. So we're hoping to see these short programs kind of be a regular feature with the materials and the things that PA museums offer. And so without further ado, I would love to go ahead and introduce Kelsey Paul here. You know, the Frick has spent an intensive period of time over the last couple of years rethinking what they're doing. And this tour, the new Clayton tour, was designed to kind of focus more on the stories of real people, to, in a sense, demystify the Frick family a little bit, and to foster a greater sense of inclusivity. And the Frick, for those of you who are not familiar with it outside of the Pittsburgh area, it's not actually just one site. There are multiple museums on the property, but certainly one of the keystone pieces is Clayton, the Frick family mansion. And the tour, which I think was debuted in about June 2024. Is that correct, Kelsey? June. Has gotten rave reviews. And I think, especially if you're familiar with the ASLH's definition of good history, that is, you know, looking at those complex stories, the kind of messy background of history, it's also more intriguing and more emotionally satisfying and fulfilling history. So the new tour that Clayton did is a great, that the Frick has done for Clayton is a great example of this. And as we were looking around for different ideas for PA museums, we thought, especially for those of you who are outside of the Pittsburgh area, we know it's not easy for everybody to get here, although I highly recommend taking the tour in person. We thought that this would be a great subject for a webinar so you could hear from them firsthand about what they did and maybe get some great ideas for your own site. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Kelsey Paul. Kelsey has been sharing her passion for history and the arts in the museum field for nearly a decade. And she currently, as I mentioned, serves as interim director of learning and visitor experience at the Frick Pittsburgh, where she oversees a talented team of educators and facilitators. She is a graduate of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign with a degree in history and received a master's degree in museum studies from George Washington University. So Kelsey, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you, Leslie. That was a very generous introduction. I am very excited to be here. One of my favorite things to talk about is our work in Clayton. Over the last several years, the Frick has been undertaking this really multi-year project to completely reimagine our visitor experience in Clayton, which is the historic home of Henry Clay Frick and his family, as Leslie mentioned. The end result of that project is the tour that Leslie was talking about, which is our what we consider to be our really like flagship public tour offering in Clayton, which we call Gilded, Not Golden. And I'll talk a little bit about that and where we came up with that name shortly. But I was asked by PA Museums to share a little bit about what that process looked like for us, how we did it, why we did it, and some of the lessons that we learned along the way. And that is one of our favorite things to do. We received so much help and support from our colleagues in the museum field as we were navigating this process. And so it's very important to us as staff at the Frick to be able to pay that forward a little bit and share some of the things we learned and share ways that other people in the museum field can either replicate the kind of project that we had or just move in the same direction that we did if you're looking to do that, because it can be challenging, it can be daunting. And so I'm happy to be able to talk a little bit more about that with you all. But before we talk about Gilded Not Golden and where we have ended up, I think it's helpful to start by talking about where we started and introducing Clayton a little bit, particularly if you are not familiar with our site and with Clayton in particular. So like I said, I will give a very rough and down and dirty synopsis of, Clayton and sort of its historical significance. It was the primary home of Henry Clay Frick and his family from 1883 to 1905. If you're not familiar with Frick, he was a prominent industrialist in Pittsburgh during the Gilded Age, that second half of the 19th century, made his fortune primarily in coal, coke, which is a byproduct of coal, and steel. He also has a steadfast reputation in Pittsburgh for being a union buster and a strike breaker, which I will talk about in a little bit. But Clayton remained in the Frick family until the 1980s, until the death of their last child, Helen Clay Frick, who is the one who put the process in place to turn Clayton into a museum to establish what became the Frick Pittsburgh. And so Clayton opened to the public in 1990, following a multi-year, multi-million-dollar restoration process to turn it into a historic house museum. And it has operated as a historic house museum for more than 3 decades at this point. When it opened, and for the majority of those 30 years after it opened, Clayton was what I think most of us would consider to be a very traditional historic house museum. We've never had velvet ropes, we've never gone that far, but as you can see on the screen, a lot of what you would expect from a really traditional historic house museum. Very focused on decorative arts, a house sort of staged very perfectly, and a house whose story and a tour whose story really just focused on the kind of narrow experiences of the Frick family as a wealthy, well-to-do family in Pittsburgh in the 19th century. So a lot of conversations about parties and famous guests and etiquette and things like that. A little bit about the staff, and over those 30 years, we were looking for ways to broaden our stories. We had specialty tours that would go into sort of niche or specific topics. But by and large, the tour experience in Clayton didn't change much for that 30 years. And that brings us really to 2020, which was obviously a notable time for all of us, but an interesting moment specifically for the Frick Pittsburgh, given our own institutional history. So, when 2020 happened, the pandemic hit, our site, like everybody else houses closed down. Clayton closed to the public. Our staff was working from home. But in addition to all of the stuff that was happening nationally in terms of, not just what was going on with COVID, but also, this national social justice reckoning, following the murder of George Floyd and all of this internal reflection that was happening, we were in a unique moment of reflection at the Frick because we were coming up on two very big internal anniversaries. 2020 was the 70th anniversary of our art museum opening to the public, and it was the 30th anniversary of Clayton opening to the public. And so we were already sort of in this mindset of looking back on where we had been, taking stock of where we were at that moment, and then turning our eyes to the future and thinking about what we wanted this next phase of the Frick to look like. And so on the screen here, in the bottom left corner, you'll see a picture of it to an entry of one of our exhibitions that we put on in very early 2021 when the world was just starting to reopen a little bit. It was an exhibition that we called the Frick Reflects, and it really was a critical look at our institutional origin story. Our curatorial team was really examining like where our collection came from, how our collection was influenced by the Frick family and the people who collected those things, and this idea that museums are not neutral. And so we were already very much in this space of kind of re-examining things. Plus, we were also doing what a lot of us do in the museum industry, which is we were keeping track of sort of the discourse around the sustainability of historic house museums. I'm sure a lot of us have been part of those conversations. There's been a lot written about this idea that perhaps historic house museums are a little bit a dime a dozen. Are there too many of them? Are they too similar? And can historic house museums survive if they can't evolve? And so that is something that we were thinking a lot about in the context of Clayton, because Clayton is a historic gem, in our opinion. It's more than 90% original, so it's very unique sort of in the historic house museum landscape. But, we had our devoted following. Clayton has had a devoted audience for a long time. Those bread and butter audiences of historic house museum aficionados, people who love old houses, they love historic houses. But that audience was mostly staying the same, and it had mostly plateaued. We weren't seeing that audience grow very much. And we thought that was a real shame because, like I said, we really felt at the staff level that Clayton had so much more to offer than just being this beautiful house that people could sort of ogle at. And so that was where kind of the impetus for the project came from, was what could we do with Clayton, and how could we ensure that Clayton can be around for many more decades, but also how can we make Clayton useful? How can we make it more than just this beautiful relic that some people like to look at? How can it become a valuable asset to our community, and to museum goers at large? And so that was kind of the impetus, like I said, behind our project. And so what we decided to do was essentially throw it all out and start over. We basically said, you know what, our museum is closed, Clayton is closed. There has never honestly been a more perfect time for us to press pause and rethink everything. And so that's what we did. And so our original public tour, which was called Life in the Gilded Age, we decided to just, like I said, throw that out the window, and completely start from scratch. And everything and anything was on the table in terms of what that was going to look like. We did have some specific goals in mind, lots and lots of goals, but I think if I had to distill them down to the 5 that are on the screen, that's probably what makes the most sense. So like I said, we wanted to grow Clayton's audience. That's something that as museum professionals, we're often thinking about our audience. How do we get more people here? How do we generate revenue? That was certainly a part of what we wanted to do with our new tour experience, was to attract more people in general. We also wanted to follow in the footsteps of some institutions that we really admire. We were looking at organizations like President Lincoln's Cottage in Washington, D.C., the Tenement Museum in New York City, and really loving what they were doing in terms of their sort of shared dialogue experience, this shared dialogue approach that they have in their tours rather than that sort of like top-down passive listening. We loved that approach. We wanted to replicate it in Clayton. Like I said, our guided guided tours, were led by docents. Life in the Gilded Age was mostly just, it was an hour-long experience, mostly with docents just kind of sharing information and doing a little bit of conversation. But it wasn't designed to really be a dialogue, which is what we wanted the new experience to be. We absolutely wanted to decenter the experiences of the Fricks as this wealthy white family. Again, being aware of sort of the discourse around historic house museums and the honest, the criticism that they are really just mostly monuments to great white men. We were very aware of the fact that that essentially was what Clayton was. It was saved by Helen Clay Frick to be a monument and a memorial to her family and particularly to her father. But we wanted to upend that a little bit by taking a little bit more of a critical look at Frick and putting him in context in terms of our city's story. And we wanted to be a little bit more willing to have some frank conversations with our visitors about Frick's ongoing legacy, which, if you know anything about him or if you've been in Pittsburgh, you would know is a little bit problematic. Like I said, he is best known as a union buster, a strike breaker, and Pittsburgh is still to this day has deep roots in blue collar, working class lives. And so Pittsburgh is, or, Frick is often depicted as a villain in Pittsburgh's story. And we wanted to be more willing to be frank and honest about that and sort of
Will this
confront
work
that
in the
with
other
our
room? I
visitors.
wonder if the girls will
And so we wanted to do that. And then, of course, like a lot of us, in the museum profession right now, we wanted to be more inclusive. We didn't just want to be talking about this wealthy white family and their narrow perspectives. We wanted to be talking about a lot of people and elevating their stories as well. We wanted to be talking about the workers in the house, which we were doing a little bit, but we wanted to do more of. And we also wanted to talk more about the people in Pittsburgh who lived their lives outside of Clayton's walls, but were very much impacted by Frick and his decisions and the larger things that were going on in that era. We wanted to connect past to present. You may have been paying attention that the Gilded Age had like a little bit of a resurgence a couple of years ago. It was like a theme for the Met Gala a few years ago, and HBO has a Julian Fellows show now, and so the Gilded Age was sort of having a moment at the same time that historians were really starting to talk about the fact that perhaps we are living in a second Gilded Age, and that was certainly true in 2020. I think most of us would make the argument that's even more true now in 2025. And so we wanted to make those connections for our visitors and have some dialogue about that. And then, like I mentioned before, we really wanted to make Clayton useful. We didn't want Clayton to just be this beautiful relic that just sits there and never changes. We wanted it to be this vibrant sort of place where people could come together and learn and connect and make meaning together. And so those were sort of our larger project goals that we we're keeping in the back of our head as we embarked on this project. But what did the project actually look like for us? I want to say up top and up front that we had significant funding for this project, and we were very lucky to have that. I feel like that's important to acknowledge up top because I think a lot of us are very aware of the fact that funding is often a barrier to change making in our industry. And, at a time where museums are often struggling to get funding and get grant support, it's so much easier said than done to say, we're going to do this massive project and not have the resources at your disposal. And so we were very lucky to have a pretty significant grant to be able to do this. That being said, something that we always say here is that we would have done this project one way or the other, even if we hadn't had the funding that we did. We were committed to making change in Clayton and to updating the visitor experience. I can't say exactly what that would have looked like at the end result if we hadn't had the funding that we did, but it would have happened. It probably would have taken us a lot longer. It might not have ended in quite the way that it did with quite the end result that it had because we had so much important help to get us there, but it would have happened. Staff was very committed to it, and I'll share at the end of the presentation some of the strategies I think that can be implemented really at any organization, and it's not really cost prohibitive. You don't need $250,000 to be able to do some of the things that we did as part of Gilded Not Golden. But two of the most important things that money did allow us to do was to get the support and the help that we needed to do this project really well and do it really intentionally. I will never stop singing the praises of our two interpretive consultants, Rainey Tisdale and Michelle Moon. They are independent museum thinkers designers and consultants, but they often work together, and we were lucky enough to get both of them for this project. And they have a lot of experience with this kind of change management, this type of large-scale reinterpretation project. And so they were able to come in and really guide us through it, because at the staff level, our project team here at the Frick, which was mostly made up of our education team and our curatorial team, none of us had really done this before. None of us had really managed a project quite like this. And so Rainey and Michelle were really pivotal in kind of setting a map for us and telling us, sort of guiding us through the process and helping us get where we needed to go. The other thing that the grant allowed us to do was to pay to assemble an advisory board, and to compensate them for their time, which was really fantastic. In the end, I think we ended up with 14 individuals on our advisory board. That's made up of mostly, scholars, museum professionals, interpretation specialists, writers, historians, a lot of them local to Pittsburgh, but also some of them from out of state. And they were able to share their expertise with us. They all participated in a little bit of different ways. Some people were mostly content specialists. We did Zoom calls with them. They pointed out some things that we needed to be reading. They pointed out some things that we needed to be thinking about on the content side, or pointed us in the direction of some content we wanted to look at. And then we had some others, particularly the folks who were museum professionals and interpretation specialists, who actually came here to the Frick for a 2-day intensive, where we just brainstormed. And that was facilitated by Rainey and Michelle. And we really were just throwing anything at the wall. We spent time in Clayton. Rainey and Michelle facilitated some creative thinking exercises for us. And that is honestly where a lot of what ended up being Gilded Not Golden came from. Those ideas originated in those brainstorming sessions. The other things that we did that were so important is that we spoke with other colleagues in the field, and we visited as many museums that were doing the kind of work that we wanted to be doing as possible. We were, before we had our funding and before we had Rainey and Michelle, we felt like we were a little bit rudderless. I will be honest, we didn't really know where to get started. And so what we started doing was cold calling and emailing folks in the field who we knew were doing the kind of work that we wanted to be doing. So we talked to folks at President Lincoln's Cottage. We talked to folks at the Tenement Museum. We spoke to people at Monticello because they have gone through a similar sort of reinterpretation process around the way that they interpret Jefferson and slavery. And so although the content is not really the same for us, we wanted to talk to them because they had so much experience with sort of that change management, both externally and then also internally with their staff. And people were so generous with their time and giving us advice and helping us to think through what we needed to be prepared for. And then, our funding allowed us to actually get out and go to some of these places and see what they were doing on the ground, which was really incredible. The last and probably biggest piece of the puzzle, if I'm being honest, is that we had to completely retrain our staff, both in content and methodology. I'll talk a little bit about what the challenges of that was. If I'm being honest, it was honestly the hardest part, and it had to be the most intentional part. We had a staff, when we started this project, we had a staff of like 35 to 40 part-time, what we called docents at the time. We call them tour facilitators now. And it took a lot of change management and conversation and intentional time to explain to those folks why we were doing what we were doing, and to ensure them that they should trust us to follow us along. And that was difficult, and it resulted in a tour staff that looks different than it did at the time. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Just for sort of like context as well, I think it's helpful to think about what the timeline for us was. From the moment that we sort of said, yes, we're doing this, we're starting from scratch, we're getting a new tour, to the moment that Gilded Not Golden launched in May of 2023 was about a year and a half. So it was a long time, and it was a long time coming. The bulk of that really intensive work was happening from sort of the summer of 2022 into the spring of 2023. But I would say even now in early 2025, there are still things that we're sort of finessing, and things that we're working out, prototypes that we're moving into a final phase, and so the work in a lot of ways is still not done. Gilded Not Golden and Clayton is still a big part of my daily job and sort of things that I'm thinking about. So it did take a long time. The other thing that I want to point out here on this timeline that is helpful for context is the tab where it says reopened Clayton to the public in April 2022. Like I said, we closed the house obviously for COVID. We kept Clayton Clayton closed longer than any of the rest of our site. The rest of our site, including our other two museums, which is a car and carriage museum and an art museum, opened semi-open with a lot of safety parameters in the fall of 2020 and into the early 2021. Clayton did not reopen to the public until spring of 2022. That was largely because we were being extremely cautious because of the ongoing effects of the pandemic. Clayton is obviously an old house. It has a semi-antiquated 1990 HVAC system, and so we had a lot of concerns about sort of the air quality and the safety in there, and so we held off. But that gave us time to sort of do some things that we wanted to do, because we really felt strongly that we could not reopen Clayton and just go back to life in the Gilded Age, that public tour that I said we've had for 30 years. Following all of the stuff that was going on in the world, that tour felt very antiquated to us. It felt very disingenuous, and it felt like it would have been a very prominent step backward for us if we were to just sort of go back to that tour. And so we did a lot of initial work to just change the direction of our tour. The tour that opened in April 2022 was not Gilded, Not Golden, but it was an opportunity for us to change the direction, change the content. We started testing out some ideas of things that we thought we might want to talk about. And that was really helpful for us because we were able to learn a little bit about our visitors and sort of what their reception was going to be to something like this ahead of Gilded, Not Golden launching basically a year later. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the end in terms of strategies that can be replicated. So one of the things that Leslie asked me to talk about was, to share a little bit of our experience with both the support that we received for this project, but also some of the pushback, because there was definitely both, as there is with any sort of big, large scale change. And so, we had kind of two categories of stakeholders of things that, we were considering with this project. We have our internal stakeholders, so our board, our executive leadership, and then of course our interpretive staff, and sort of at the staff level, particularly when I say interpretive staff, I mean, our tour guides who were actually working with the public, and that is their main, job responsibility. And then of course we have the external stakeholders. We have, our members, our longtime visitors, and then potentially, any new audiences that we wanted to attract. There's always, with anything, there's what you sort of can prepare for and what you think is going to happen, and then there's what actually happened. And there was some crossover in those things through the course of our project. I'll start with the internal stakeholders. People often ask us what kind of support we had at the board level, and more specifically, they ask us what support we had with any family descendants. There are Frick family descendants. There's quite a few of them, actually. 6 of them sit on our board. And so people are often very curious to hear what they in particular thought of this project. We were very lucky because the family members who sit on our board now were very receptive to this. They were very supportive. They were one of the strongest sort of contingent of supporters that we had at the board level right off the bat. They are aware of their family's story. They're aware of Henry Clay Frick's reputation. And they really were the ones that encouraged us not to shy away from that. They didn't expect us to wear kid gloves around that, which was really fantastic and was really helpful. We also had a lot of support at the executive director level. Our executive director at the time, Lizzie Barker, was very supportive of this. She really championed this project for us. She and our advancement and development team, went after that funding for us, which we were really lucky to have. We did expect the most pushback internally from that staff level interpretive staff, the tour guides. I shared already a little bit about what they looked like. That it was a large group of like 40 of them, very, very, very part-time. Some of them only working once every couple of months before the pandemic, and largely retirees, in the coming out of like the schooling and education, some coming out of like the history field, but not what you would consider to be museum professionals, people who kind of do this as their primary career path. And so we had to spend a lot of time explaining to them why we were going to do this. They couldn't, some of them really had a hard time wrapping their brain around it because they love Clayton, but they also loved the tour as it was. They themselves are historic house museum lovers. They didn't see a problem with the way that the tour went. And we had to be really intentional to explain, like, there isn't a problem with the way that we were doing it. It's just that we could be doing so much more. And we love Clayton so much that we want it to be somewhere that other people want to come and love it as well. And so that took a lot of time to explain to them. And we did lose folks. Like I said, we had 40 when we started. Today, I can tell you I have 21. I have 21 part-time tour facilitators. Those folks are much more present. They work much more often. They are trained differently. There is some overlap from that previous group and some of the new folks. But we were very honest with our staff about what we were doing, and we gave them an out. We were very clear to say, we understand that we're changing the rules of the game a little bit. We're changing what we're asking you to do, and we understand that we're asking you to trust us, because we were telling them that we were going to change it, but we couldn't tell them what the end result was really going to be. And so there was a lot of faith that they had to have in us. And some folks just chose to leave. They just decided that it wasn't for them and didn't want to go through the whole retraining process. Others stayed, and I'm very happy to say that of the ones that have stayed, they all love the direction that we have gone. They have come to really love doing the Gilded Not Golden tour, and I often hear from them that they are really enjoying the experiences that they have and the conversations that they have with visitors. So it was a long process. There were definitely some ups and downs, a lot of growing pains, but it did eventually get there. And I'm very happy with where we ended up at the staff level. I will also point out what we ended up getting at the board level outside of the Frick family members was some confusion. Like, a lot of our board members and trustees would sort of say, yeah, this sounds good. But it was very clear at some point that a lot of them just didn't understand what we were doing or why. And one of the smartest things that our executive director at the time did was that she started hosting these, what we called trustee learning sessions, where we would take trustees into the house, and we would model for them sort of what our old interpretation looked like and give them sort of an example of that. And then we would model sort of what we wanted to do to kind of give an example of what eventually became Gilded Not Golden. And that was so eye-opening for a lot of them, and it allowed them to really understand what we were doing and understand the value of that. And the folks who participated in those learning sessions really became some of our best advocates in terms of what we were trying to do, and they still love Gilded Not Golden, and they will sing its praises all day long. So it was really valuable to us to be able to do that for them. Quickly, to talk about external stakeholders, as with anything, we expected that there would be some pushback from visitors, primarily that bread and butter audience that Clayton has had, our members who just loved it for being a beautiful old house and weren't expecting much more from that. Those decorative arts lovers, people who that's really what they like and that's what they seek out in a tour. So we expected a little bit of pushback from them, but we were hoping that we would be able to entice them to come along. I think that we've done that. I think we've managed to entice quite a few of them to stay supporters and to still love Clayton. But we also lost some. But we had people who just, Clayton and Gilded Not Golden is not quite their thing, and that's okay. One of the things that I think we anticipated a little bit, but it's still sort of funny when it happens, is that we have a small contingent of critics. And when I say small, I say they're very much in the minority. Usually what the criticism is that we are being woke, or that, we changed this tour out of a desire to be woke, or, and that's fine. Honestly, internally, we laugh at that a little bit. We wear it a little bit like a badge of honor. To us, it is not about being woke or, being politically correct or whatever it is. It's about good history. It's about doing history well, and having conversations that are real and honest. And that is what's important to us. So it doesn't bother us that we get a little bit of that. Like I said, it's very few. But what's most exciting is that we have been able to reach those new audiences that we wanted to. We have seen Clayton's attendance jump quite a bit and continues to grow. And we are getting so much great visitor feedback from folks who, have said, like, I never toured Clayton before. I came because this tour sounded interesting. I never would have wanted to come before. And so that has been really validating for us to feel like, we took a little bit of a leap of faith and believed that this was the right direction, but it's been very fantastic to see that our instincts were right. The audiences were there and we can get them here. And that has been really, really exciting as well. So I did really quickly, just for those of you who are not familiar with the tour, Leslie gave a very nice sort of general description at the beginning, which is really, really helpful. But this is sort of our long form tour description. We have a much shorter sort of 1 to 2 sentence description that lives on our website, but this is the one that lives on sort of our in-depth Clayton page for people who are really trying to understand what the tour is. And I think it's a helpful, pretty good description of sort of what we ended up with. What I always tell people about Gilded Not Golden is that it is ultimately it is a tour about an era, and it is a tour about a city at a specific time. It is not a tour necessarily about one family. The Fricks are part of the story, but they are just one part of the story. And there are moments on the tour where we really zoom in on their particular personal experiences. And then there are a lot of moments on the tour where we really zoom out and we're talking more about putting them in context and understanding the world in which they lived. And we have really leaned into this idea of gilding. Gilding is really one of the main primary themes of the tour, which is this idea that, for those of you who are not familiar, Mark Twain actually coined the term the Gilded Age in sort of a satirical commentary on the fact that as an era, it's easy to be distracted by all of the progress and the technology and the wealth, but that was just a really thin veneer, and that if you dug even a little bit underneath for what the Gilded Age actually was, what you found was a lot of social unrest, social inequality, wealth inequality, and challenging change. And so that is really what we have leaned into with Gilded Not Golden. Is we always say we're peeling back the gilding a little bit, and we're taking a little bit more of a closer look at the harsh realities underneath, and then we're looking at how some of those harsh realities play into our current moment, and how the legacy of the Gilded Age continues to impact us today. So that being said, let's get to the useful part of this, which is how can people, who are interested in doing this kind of change at their own institutions start to put that into practice, whether you have funding or not. I very specifically chose things that I think can be replicated, in a bunch of different ways and that don't require a huge grant or even honestly like a huge long, 1.5 year project like what we did. And I'll go through each of these sort of one by one and give some kind of concrete examples of how we did that and talk about how we were able to make that happen for ourselves within the context of Gilded Not Golden. So first thing that I think anybody can really do is you can reevaluate your narrative. We took a hard look at the stories that we were telling and the stories that we wanted to tell, and we tried to find some crossover between those things. But like I said, we were willing to throw it all out the window and start over. There is a lot of our original content in Gilded Not Golden. But there's, like I said, there's some overlap, but the overall focus has shifted. Life in the Gilded Age had a really, really big period of significance. We were interpreting pretty much the entire time that the Fricks lived there, which was very hard to do and meant that we could only storytell at kind of the very surface level. We could only give people in a 60-minute tour the broad strokes of a multi-decade life in a house. Gilded Not Golden focuses primarily on the year 1892. That's 1 year in the Fricks' lives here, but it's a very significant year in that it was sort of a climax in a lot of ways of a lot of things that both the Fricks were dealing with internally. They lost some children around that year. Frick was almost assassinated that year. They're dealing with the Homestead lockout and strike that year. And so there's a lot of stuff happening sort of at the personal level for the Fricks, but then also like larger in terms of Pittsburgh's story. And so we focus on that. And so it allows us to go much, much deeper with our storytelling. Like I mentioned, the Fricks are just sharing the stage now. They are not the ones that are constantly in the spotlight. It is their home. We talk about them and their experiences, but it really is about the era, and it is really about Pittsburgh. Like I tell people that honestly, is that the tour is about Pittsburgh at a time where Pittsburgh was arguably the most important city in the country, if not the world. It was the industrial center of everything in the Gilded Age, and so much important stuff was happening here. And so that is what we're talking about on this tour. And the Fricks are just sort of one example of people who were experiencing that. And so we use them in that way as sort of characters in the story. We have shifted our focus away from decorative arts. We absolutely talk about the stuff that is in the house, but really only in a way that serves the larger story. We have long talked about the fact that eventually we probably will offer like a thematic tour that focuses on, you know, design and decorative arts. We're not there yet, but eventually we probably will do that. But Gilded Not Golden is not that tour. And we are try to be very clear with people that it is not a decorative arts tour. And then of course we did adopt that sort of shared dialogue approach. Our tours are facilitated conversations in a large way. Yes, there's a lot of information that our guides give, but it is really intended to be a dialogue, and we invite visitors to sort of share their perspectives and share their thoughts and experiences as part of the tour experience as well. That is something that honestly anybody can do, right? It's just a matter of sort of taking a seat back and asking yourselves the internal questions, and then choosing to make space for the stories that you want to tell to just freshen up your narrative a little bit. And it's really daunting in some ways, but it's also really freeing and really exciting to be able to do that. And I would definitely recommend that sort of moment of reflection for honestly anybody if you're thinking of doing something like this. The other thing that I will promote all day long about a project like this is to learn from others. I mentioned already how we had our advisory board. You know, we learned from colleagues in the field. We went and visited other museums that we liked what they were doing. I wanted to give a really concrete example, though, in the context of Gilded Not Golden, of what that looked like for us and the benefit of having that kind of expertise and listening to it. What you're seeing on the screen is a picture of an interactive activity that we have in the reception room of Clayton, which we call our capital mapping exercise. Essentially, guides facilitate a conversation with visitors using these cards that you're seeing. It allows us to introduce sort of our cast of characters of people in the Frick family, but also people who were in their orbit, while also having this conversation about how the Fricks built their wealth, and how they got to where they were. And so you see this really complicated map, essentially this web of all of these different connections. The entire genesis of this idea came from one of our advisors, a historian named Dr. Rudy Batzel. He is a professor of history and capitalism at Lake Forest College. And he introduced this idea on one of our early sort of conversations of different forms of capital. And he was talking about, you know, it's social capital, it's, you know, the people you know, the connections you have, it's cultural capital, it's your access to the finer things in life and your taste, your education. And then it's also financial capital. It's the money, right? But all of those things feed into each other. And when you're talking about someone like Henry Clay Frick, who is not just playing the game of capitalism, but winning the game of capitalism, he has access to all three. And he's constantly interchanging them to grow his status and grow his wealth, and get more capital. And we thought that was so fascinating. And the more we thought about it, we realized so much of our story, you can go all through Clayton and you can point out different forms of capital and how it's constantly being exchanged. And so that has become really a major sort of foundational concept of what Gilded Not Golden is understanding this idea of how the underpinnings of capitalism, how that was being formed in the Gilded Age, and honestly how we're still living with that in a lot of ways. So that's one just really concrete example of how we were able to take this expertise from somebody that we didn't really know, and we were not familiar with the concept, but he was able to plant that seed for us, and it became a huge part of what we ended up with. So finding those people who know what you don't is so valuable, and it can generate the seed of an idea that you never would have gotten to on your own. So I would definitely recommend listening to those experts or seeking them out. The next thing that I think anybody can do is look at what you already have and just breathe a little bit of new life into it. So, you know, alongside the content of the tour, we also wanted to change up the way Clayton physically appeared to people to bring it a little bit more to life. You know, I mentioned Clayton was a very traditional historic house museum. Everything was always staged very perfectly, nothing crooked or out of order. And that's lovely and beautiful, but we wanted Clayton to feel lived in. We didn't want it to feel like it was frozen in time. We wanted to feel honestly like the Fricks had almost just walked into the other room and we were interrupting them in the middle of their lives. And so our brilliant curatorial team, particularly our collections manager, Morgan Lawrence, thought really creatively about how she could use objects that were already in our collection and just stage them to create these really interesting vignettes. And so you have the breakfast room before on the left, staged very traditionally with settings on the table, a gorgeous room, no doubt. But what you see now when you go into the breakfast room is a staging of Henry Clay Frick's weekly poker games, which happened also in the breakfast room. It looks like the game is in progress. These are all collection items, his actual poker chips, his actual whiskey bottles, his actual cards and cigars, all of these things. And it now allows us to have this conversation about Frick and his relationship to power, his relationship to other wealthy industrialists, and sort of how they were able to wield that power and impact things, far outside the walls of Clayton. And so people love this scene. It's one of my favorite rooms in the house. It's always surprising to folks. But like I said, this was just stuff that we already had. We just chose to show it a little bit differently and to support the stories that we were trying to tell. I have another example in our parlor. So on the left, you see our parlor as it used to appear. Very simple and just sort of staged in a basic way. Now, when you walk into Clayton's parlor, you see a cleaning vignette. And so it is staged as if the maids, Mary Coyne and Bridget Conray, are in the middle of doing their daily cleaning rounds in Clayton. You'll also notice on that window, it's a little hard to see in this video or in this picture, you can see it's a vinyl semi-translucent window cling, which is a blown up image of a steel mill. That is not the view that the Fricks would have had, but it's there as sort of a conversation starter and a reminder of the ever-present impact of the steel industry, particularly on the environment, and how all of that smoke and dust and grime being pumped into the air impacted people's experiences and, for example, impacted the work of the maids who were trying to clean it. And so again, it's just surprising and different, and it's not what people necessarily expect, but it sparks all of these interesting conversations, and it allows us to just tell a little bit of a different story in a way that is maybe not what people expected. We also have some other smaller interventions that, again, are not super expensive. These price tags are printed on cardstock, and our curatorial team installed them into the house. They appear, there's like 5 or 6 of them. They appear throughout the house, but they are basically a cost comparison. They put the context of the Frick's wealth on display for you by comparing what they paid for it in 1892 and then what it would have cost a different person of a different lifestyle in the Gilded Age to do the same thing. So our orchestrion, which is basically our big player piano, it's like a big jukebox, essentially, 19th century jukebox. Frick paid $5,000 for that instrument in 1892. That's 8 years of labor and wages for the average steel worker by comparison. Our Testolini glassware in the dining room is Italian Venetian glass, cost about $2,700. That is enough to feed a family of 5 in Homestead, which is a steel mill community in Pittsburgh, for 10 and a half years. So again, these are passive interventions. Our guides don't even necessarily talk about them specifically, but they're something that the visitors encounter on the tour, and it just allows for a little bit of a moment of sort of thought-provoking, questioning, and that context that we are really, really looking for. The last thing that I will just say is that, take baby steps. Like I said, we started out with a tour, when we opened the house in May of 2022. April of 2022, that was not Gilded, Not Golden, but it was a baby step towards that. It wasn't Life in the Gilded Age either. It was a chance for us to experiment with some things that we wanted to try. I think that was a really helpful strategy for us for a couple of reasons. One, it gave our guides the opportunity to practice doing this sort of new content. It also allowed us to kind of softball it to our visitors. So by the time that Gilded, Not Golden did actually launch, it didn't feel so abrupt to people, I think, because if they were paying attention, they were noticing already that our content and our tour was kind of changing. And so Clayton, I could easily see if we had gone from just Life in the Gilded Age to Gilded, Not Golden, that would have probably felt very abrupt and very shocking to people. But because we had sort of stepped into it a little bit more lightly, I think it didn't feel like that to a lot of people. And the people who already were not liking our direction had sort of self-selected out at that point by the time that Gilded Now Golden had launched. And so, just being able to try some stuff out, see what works, see what doesn't, change some interpretation in a couple of rooms to start. The other great advice that we were given early on is to start offering public programs that talk about the kind of content that we wanted to put on the tour as sort of a complement, as a way to sort of attract new audiences and get people here. And so we've done that quite a bit, and Gilded Now Golden has no sort of limit on sort of things that we could talk about in a public program setting or a specialty tour setting. And that has been really helpful to us as well. So I know I'm going a little bit over on time, and I know we need to make sure that we have time for questions. So that is primarily what I had. Are there any questions that I can answer? I've been seeing things in the chat, but I'm only seeing things sort of fly by. So what questions do everyone have?
And we have a couple questions
Great.
that are here now. We'll start up here. Michael Norris, with the goal to attract new audiences, did you identify specific kinds of audiences you wanted to attract? And if so, did you have any targeted strategies to reach them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there were sort of two things that we wanted to do, right? We wanted to attract museum goers who are not necessarily in that museum or historic house museum aficionado group. We were looking at kind of the larger audience studies of museum goers, and it's like there's all museum goers, and then there's this little percentage of people who really, really love historic house museums. We knew we had those folks. We wanted to get into those other sort of audiences of museum goers, younger folks, young professionals, young, just a different sort of, demographic. So we wanted to get into that broader audience. If I had to identify, though, a specific demographic of audience that we were trying to get here, I would say we wanted folks who are like true Yinzers. So if you are familiar with Pittsburgh, a Yinzer is sort of a local term for like just bread and butter Pittsburghers, right? Like born and raised Pittsburghers, deep roots in industry and working class, blue collar. By and large, like that audience, that section of our community here in Pittsburgh didn't really want anything to do with Clayton or with us because of our association with Henry Clay Frick. Like his reputation is that loud here. And the perception was that we were not a place for those people because all we were was sort of a monument to him. And we weren't willing to sort of talk about the harsher realities of who he was. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to demonstrate to that part of our community, like, hey, we are not Henry Clay Frick apologists. We want to talk about who he was, and we want to have honest conversations about the impact that he had on our city, good and bad. And we want to elevate the stories of other Pittsburghers, namely steelworkers who made his wealth possible. Because the truth is that Henry Clay Frick is nothing if not built on the labor of the people who worked for him, and the people he exploited, to be totally honest and frank. And so that was a big, big part of it. As far as strategies for how we did that, we worked with another organization in our city called Rivers of Steel, which is the heritage area who interprets the history of industry in our city. They were on our advisory board. They gave us very real feedback about sort of how we should be talking about these things. They pointed out information that we need to be thinking about. And then I have to sort of give a big credit to our marketing team, who has been very, very intentional about how they talk about what this tour is, and how they put it out there, and that they are putting the effort behind it to get it in front of people in a way that is captivating and interesting to get people to give us a chance. So sorry, that was a little bit of a long-winded question or answer, but
and here's another. This is an interesting question from Lynn at the Roebling Museum. I went on the tour this past fall, and one thing I noticed is that whenever we'd start to talk as a group, it seemed to worry the tour guide. She kept saying we were going overtime or that we were behind.
yeah.
Did that come up in the planning? How do you balance a dialogic style tour with the realities of being a popular site with timed tours? Something that
Absolutely.
the Tenement Museum apparently suffers from this too.
Yes. And that was something that we were told by, staff and museums that do this kind of thing, which is that the timing is always going to be a struggle, right? And so Gilded Not Golden is a longer tour. Life in the Gilded Age was 60 minutes. We market Gilded Not Golden as 75 minutes. So we built in another 15 minutes knowing that it was going to take more time. Even then, 75 minutes is almost impossible to achieve. I would say most of my guides, they probably average closer to like 85 minutes. And that's okay, because sometimes it's because the conversation is that good and is that meaty. But we had to spend a lot of time, when I talk about retraining our guides, we had to spend a lot of time coaching them through that time management. And that is something that is ongoing. That is something that, I have training check-ins with that group of staff, periodically. And it's something we are always talking about, which is, how do you manage time? How do you make sure that you're not giving a 90-minute or a 2-hour tour, which is insane, and also make space for that? And ultimately what it comes down to is that the tour guides have to choose to cede a little bit of the power. They have to step off of the soapbox. They have to be really selective about what they talk about so that they can make space for those conversations. And that is a lot easier said than done. And so, yeah, what you saw, I think, is a little bit of sort of how that looks practically on the actual tour end. And it's something that I think all of our guides are constantly working on and thinking about. I have to say, I have to appreciate that your tour guide was looking at her watch, because I also have a problem with guides who don't look at their watch. And those are the folks that are in the house for 2 hours, and then I have to have a conversation with them. So, but yeah, that is absolutely part of the challenge.
And then another question, are there any subjects you would like to cover in the future?
Yes. So there are absolutely things, we do realize that we still do have an audience for that decorative arts crowd. And Clayton is such a unique venue for that, because it is 90% original. It's so much of the Frick's actual stuff. And so we do envision a world where we will have a thematic decorative arts tour. But we have always said that when that happens, it will be a decorative arts tour that is much more in the vein of Gilded Not Golden, which is, rather than just talking about all of the pretty stuff and talking about how much, how important it was, we want to have a conversation about like how that played into the Frick's cultural capital, for example, and sort of what the where do things like silver and mahogany come from? Like, what is the chain of supply, and how does that impact like other people and the environment? We still want to do stuff that is more thought-provoking. I will also say Gilded Not Golden is part of a document that we call our Living Interpretive Plan, which is a loose sort of plan that sort of breaks down kind of how the Clayton tour is, how it came to be, what its themes are, what its methodology is, that allows us to apply that to other museums and other projects. Clayton, the tour Gilded Not Golden, is also designed to be flexible, which means that it's pretty easy for us to update content-wise to kind of meet the moment. So I can give a very specific example of that, which is we were able to train our guides pretty quickly and on the fly, following the assassination attempt on Donald Trump in Butler, PA, and then also following the murder of the healthcare executive in New York City recently, because Henry Clay Frick also had, an assassination attempt on him by someone who, disagreed with him and his business practices. And so because of the way that the tour is designed and the fact that it's flexible, we were able to sort of prep our guides pretty quickly to be able to answer that when it would come up from visitors, and sort of help facilitate that connection from visitors and help them deal with that in the right way. So I would say, there is really no limit to where we can go with Gilded Not Golden, because it is flexible, and we probably will over time, update it from time to time to keep it feeling fresh and relevant.
So it looks like there are no more questions for the moment. And in the interest of keeping our lunch and learns to that lunch hour, let me just say again, thank you so much, Kelsey. What a fantastic overview of this project. If there's anybody, I see a couple people turning cameras on. If you'd like to ask any last questions, that's fine. But we'll also say thank you again for attending this session. Watch for our next Lunch and Learn. That will be on May 14th. And have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Kelsey, can we bother you? Can I have your email address?
Yes, yes. So thank you for mentioning that. Yeah. So my email address is actually not on our website, but it's very easy to deduce. So it is kpaul, so KPAUL at
Mhm.
the Frick Pittsburgh. So it's all spelled out, .org. And yes, anyone is welcome to email me. Like I said, one of my favorite things to do is talk about Clayton and Gilded, Not Golden. And so I consider it very much paying it forward to be able to give advice or sort of let you pick my brain. So anyone is more than welcome to reach out anytime.
And thank you again, Kelsey. You know, I think that message, that lesson of talk to other people, ask other people is so valuable. I mean, you get so many other great ideas, and it's a great piece to stress too as part of the value of a group like PA Museum. So
Absolutely. I think as a group, museum professionals, we're not gatekeepers. Like we love to talk about
mm,
what we know and what we learn and sharing. And so that is definitely true of us at the Frick. So we are happy to talk anytime.
thank you so much. And
Yeah,
thank
thank you
you to
so
the
much.
rest of you for tuning in today.
Thank you.
Thank you again. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for taking the time and
Yeah, of course. It was fun.
sharing a few secrets with us.
It's always a challenge to take a 1.5-year project and distill it down to like 30, 45 minutes. I do apologize. I did go a
I
little
know.
Oh, no, it's fantastic.
Time-wise, I think that was actually perfect. I
Oh, good.
mean, there was enough for a few questions. I don't know if others might have had that, but I mean, we've really pitched this as it's about an hour, and it's really hard to do a program that is specifically an hour. So no, that your timing actually worked out really well. That was
Good.
really pretty perfect. So
Good, I'm glad.
thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was we're always excited to get the request. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I hope some more people make the trip over to Pittsburgh.
Yeah, we would
to get it in
love
person.
that. Yeah, thank you for helping us promote it too.
You're welcome. Bye.
All right. Bye, guys.